Boom, and just like that, it is week 13 of the fantasy season, so you know exactly what we need to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, break down every single wide receiver, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting here in week 13 of the fantasy season. All right, let's kick it off with one of 3 Thanksgiving Day games, starting with the earliest matchup. That'll be the Packers traveling to face the Lions in a divisional matchup. Let's start with the Packers side of things. Romeo Doubs, Christian Watson, both in the flex category, but quite frankly, I kind of feel like they should probably be closer to the risky flex category than just the regular flex category. But, you know, this is a pretty weak secondary in terms of the Lions defense. They have been in the bottom 12 pretty consistently here in terms of fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. And this feels like one of those games where the Packers will be kind of forced to throw the football more than usual, as the Lions defense has been pretty good, to say the least, against the running back position on the season. So Doubs, Watson, they're certainly not my favorite flex options this week, but they're 2 guys who can always fall into the flex category. But if they don't find the end zone, you're not going to feel too great overall. But Thanksgiving Day game, should be some excitement, should be some points scored, so I'll leave them as flex options moving into the week, and they're really the only wide receivers on this team that we can consider. Then we move to the Lions side of things. Let's just go ahead and straight up say Amon-Ra St. Brown, no matter what, you were starting him every single week. 13 targets this past week, 9 catches, 8 touchdown, 149 total receiving yards, 29.9 fantasy points. Doesn't matter what the matchup is, and the Packers have been top 10 against the wide receiver position on the season, but you got to keep Amon-Ra St. Brown in the start category. Now, we finally moved Jameson Williams out of the riskiest flex ever category, one of the only players to get that title throughout the course of the season, to the start category this past weekend. What did he do? He went from 3 straight games with 16.6 or more fantasy points and a touchdown in each of those games to 0 fantasy points. So maybe we should have never taken Jameson Williams out of that category. And maybe he needs to be booted back, but I'm just going to leave him as like a low-end start, maybe flex option. I mean, he had 3 targets. That was it. No catches. But he was on the field for 97% of snaps, and he's still going to get usage is what I believe. But who knows as the season progresses here. But once again, Thanksgiving Day game, divisional game. This division overall is very tight right now. So I'm just going to leave JMO as a low-end start, but maybe the riskiest low-end start possible. We'll see how this one shakes out on the holiday moving into week 13. Second game on Thanksgiving is going to be the Chiefs traveling to face the Cowboys. Let's go ahead and start with the Chiefs side of things. Rashee Rice, really the only player that we need to consider here at the wide receiver position. 24.1 fantasy points, 12 targets, 8 catches, 141 total receiving yards. He continues to be the dominant, really only receiving threat outside of Travis Kelce for the Chiefs on a week in, week out basis. So against this Cowboys secondary, I am definitely starting Rashee Rice, as they have given up the 2nd most fantasy points and 18 total receiving yards to the wide receiver position so far on the season. So it's a smash spot for Rashee Rice. Once again, holiday game, kind of a primetime game. This should be a great spot for Rice. He's an absolute must start. Anybody else here? Xavier Worthy, Hollywood Brown, Tyquan Thornton, Juju Smith-Schuster. Just no thank you. I mean, Worthy had a little bit better involvement this past week, 8 targets compared to the 7 or less targets we've seen in every game since week 6. He also got a little bit banged up. Rashee Rice also got a little bit banged up, but looks like they're not on any injury report or anything. They're good to go this week. So maybe Worthy's like a risky flex just due to the matchup, but I'm just staying away from these Chiefs wide receivers if they're not named Rashee Rice moving into the week. Then we move to the Cowboys. You kind of have the opposite situation here. Tough matchup, as the Chiefs are top 8 in terms of fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. And I know some people kind of feeling down on CeeDee Lamb right now, and that's fair. He had 11 targets, but only 4 catches in like a big competitive game where the Cowboys were playing from behind, throwing the football a ton. Also dropped that touchdown that should have been a touchdown, right? Just 11.5 fantasy points, but he's still been very solid. Every game he's played this year, he's given me double-digit fantasy points, and he's still seeing good enough volume. You know, he has had 7 or more targets in every game since week 7, still had 11 targets, like we said. this past week. So I'm keeping CeeDee Lamb in starting lineups, and which should be another, kind of close game here with the offense needing to throw the football. And yeah, George Pickens, there's no way we're taking him out of starting lineups. I did talk going into week 12, I was a little bit worried because that week 1 matchup against the Eagles, we saw a lot of Quinyon Mitchell on Pickens in week 12, but either way, it just did not matter. He has really just been extremely dominant throughout the course of the season and over the last 2 weeks as well. This is once again a tougher matchup overall than what we've gotten in the last 2 weeks for Pickens. So at some point, he is going to regress here and kind of come back to earth, but his floor has still been extremely safe on the season with only 1 single-digit fantasy performance. And another monster week this past week, 29.6 fantasy points, 9 targets, 9 catches, 146 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So there's no way I am benching George Pickens moving into week 13. The final game on Thanksgiving is going to be the Bengals traveling to face the Ravens in a big divisional game. Let's start with the Bengals side of things. Jamar Chase will be back in action after missing week 12 due to Spitgate and being suspended for a game. But now we're going to be without T. Higgins in week 13, suffering that really bad-looking concussion, and now reports are indicating he is not going to play in week 13 on a short week. And then also, very important to note here, Joe Burrow will be getting the start at the quarterback position, making a swift recovery from that turf toe surgery he had to have stemming from week 2 of the season. And, Flacco, even Browning at times, filled in admirably in terms of fantasy for the impact of the wide receivers here. But this has got to be good for Jamar Chase. And he's going to be back in lineups, going to be active. If you own Jamar Chase, you are starting him, no doubt about it. It's a good matchup here against the Ravens, still bottom 10 against opposing wide receivers on the season as a whole in terms of fantasy points allowed. Andre Ujavas, Mitch Tinsley, both kind of risky flexes here. Tinsley only had 2 catches this past week, but one of them was a touchdown. Ujavas, a little bit better volume, and he has a little bit more of a rapport with Joe Burrow. But yeah, somebody else is going to get volume here. I'd probably lean Andre Ujavas, but I think both are still risky flexes at the end of the day. Then we move to the Ravens side of things. Zay Flowers just continues to be a low-end start. He's had double digits in every game this year except for 2, but he hasn't gone over 14.9 fantasy points but 1 time this year, and that was back in week 1 of the season. He's been playing at a very, very, very low ceiling, and not even really a ceiling, just playing at like a floor of around like 11, 12-ish fantasy points, 14, whatever. But 6 targets, 5 catches, 58 receiving yards this past week, 11.9 fantasy points. This Bengals defense is better against opposing wide receivers than they are against opposing running backs. They're actually top 10 against opposing wide receivers. So Flowers, just a low-end start, but worth noting that this passing attack hasn't exactly been fluent for the Ravens over the past 2 weeks against the Browns and the Jets. And even the week before that against the Vikings, we haven't seen Lamar Jackson throw for over 200 yards since week 9. And even in that game, he only threw for 204 total yards, but he did throw 4 total passing touchdowns. So, this is a big game, right? If the Bengals win, they have like a 1% chance of making the playoff. The Ravens need to win this game as well, but they are right now atop of this division after the Steelers lost this past week. So it's going to be a back and forth tight divisional race as it always is with this division, but this is a must-win game for both teams. So I am expecting the offenses to show up. So Zay Flowers will remain a start. Anybody else here, Rashad Bateman, who's been hurt, or DeAndre Hopkins, they're just going to be sits for me moving into week 13. I'm headed straight to Underdog to take the over on Jamar Chase's total receiving yards in his return from being suspended. With Joe Burrow back on the field, Jamar Chase balled out against the Ravens last year. I think he's going to absolutely ball out on Thanksgiving Day, regardless of the outcome of this game. Don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH are getting a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 13 NFL action. Take that free Pick'em. Take Chase's over on receiving yards. If both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically double your cash entry. And on top of that, as long as you sign up using promo code THECATCH, once you play through $5 on Underdog, you're going to get $50 in bonus funds to use towards Week 13 NFL action and a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So make sure you guys sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH if you want to take advantage of all of their Week 13 exclusive NFL offers. And on Black Friday, we're going to have the Bears traveling to face the Eagles, and what's also going to be a big overall matchup for each respective team. Let's start with the Bears. I'm just putting Rome Odunze as a low-end start. I'm even hesitant to put him in the low-end start category. Liked him over the past couple weeks in certain matchups. I liked him in week 12, but 9 targets, 3 catches, 53 receiving yards, 8.3 fantasy points ain't really going to cut it. And be interesting to see where Quinyon Mitchell lines up in this game. This Eagles defense definitely has been good overall, but they kind of folded this past week against the Cowboys. They're still 18th overall against the wide receiver position. They've been playing better against the run as of late, so kind of swapped from earlier in the season. Odunze, the riskiest low-end start in the video, but I do think he could show up in this Bears team right now, top of that division. They're finding a way to win on a week-in, week-out basis, and I just feel like this is going to be a game script where Odunze is involved, but if you're moving him to like the flex category or if you don't trust him this week, I can't really blame you with the way things have been lately. He's really just a boomer bust type player. Maybe he deserves the riskiest flex ever title. That being said, we did see some good involvement out of DJ Moore this past week. 7 targets, 5 catches, 64 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, 23.4 fantasy points. So once again, due to game script, I'll put him in the risky flex category, but bear in mind, 3.1 or less fantasy points in the previous 2 games, and he faced the Steelers this past week, who've given up the most fantasy points to wide receivers, so truly a risky flex. Now, Luther Burden has overtaken the volume here in terms of the pecking order in front of Olamide Zacchaeus now, but still not doing enough to be considered anything other than a sit as we move into the week. Then we look to A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith. I liked both of them going into week 12 against the Cowboys in that secondary, and they certainly showed up. Devonta Smith, 14.9 fantasy points, 11 targets, 6 catches, 89 receiving yards for him. A.J. Brown, 10 targets, 8 catches, 110 receiving yards, 8 touchdown, 25 fantasy points, and nearly had another catch that went for a touchdown, very close there. And I liked them again here against the Bears. Still a bottom 10 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. So still a good spot here. Once again, I like the potential game script here. Kind of a prime time holiday type game. So offenses should show up. Let's go ahead and continue to roll with A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith here in week 13. All right, moving into Sunday's action, let's start with the early window. We're going to have the Saints traveling to face the Dolphins coming out of their bye week. Let's start with the Saints. Chris Olave remains a start, 16 fantasy points in week 12, 13 targets, 9 catches, 70 receiving yards. Even with Tyler Shuck not having the best overall performance, Shuck was okay throwing the football. 30 of 43, 243 passing yards, just no passing touchdowns. Had an interception, had a lost fumble as well. But yeah, the offense just wasn't exactly fluent this past week. Kamara goes down. Now Devin Neal is going to be in the mix. There's really, no other true pass catcher on this team outside of Jawan Johnson. I mean, Devon Bailey saw, some okay volume this past week. But yeah, let's just keep it simple here. It's Chris Olave or nobody. But bear in mind, this Dolphins defense is not bad against the pass or the wide receiver position. 6th fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. So keep that in mind. But I think Olave still remains in the start category. And I think Jalen Waddle coming out of his bye week also remains in the start category, even with a kind of lackluster performance in week 11 against a soft Commanders defense when we last saw the Dolphins in action. 7 targets, 3 catches, 52 receiving yards, 8.2 fantasy points. That was it. But similar to Chris Olave, I mean, there's nobody else to throw to here. We see some sprinkles of Malik Washington at times, but there's just not enough here. We see a little bit of action to the tight end position, whoever is healthy at the tight end position. And then, Devon Achane is really the true second pass catcher on this team at the running back position. So good volume, always insured for Jalen Waddle. The Saints are kind of sneaky good here, 13th against the wide receiver position. But once again, volume's going to be king here. Waddle remains a start for me moving into week 13. Let's move to a big divisional matchup between the Texans and the Colts. Nico Collins, just 8.5 fantasy points in week 12. 3 targets, 3 catches, 55 receiving yards, and that was it. Now, I do want to go ahead and mention we are probably going to get C.J. Stroud at quarterback this week, but we might not. I think this could be kind of up and down throughout the week. I actually like Davis Mills as a starting quarterback more for fantasy purposes than C.J. Stroud is. what I have decided on, but Stroud has still had some nice games throughout the year. And Nico has, for the most part, performed, whether it's been Stroud or Davis Mills, with just 3 games on the season with single digits. And I know this past week wasn't great necessarily, which is 8.5 fantasy points, so definitely not great. But still, I'm going to keep the faith here, and this should be a game, similar to what we saw at like the Chiefs this past week, where the Texans are probably going to need to throw the football throughout the course of the game. And yes, it's a tough matchup. The Chiefs are giving up the 8th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers, but Nico Collins remains in the start category for me. He's just one of those guys who hard to get out of that category. Move to Jaden Higgins. I'm just going to go ahead and call him a risky flex. 3 receiving touchdowns in the last 5 games. Been a bit up and down here. And yeah, these Texans wide receivers, not named Nico Collins, have been incredibly inconsistent on the season. We saw Christian Kirk kind of come out of nowhere and have a nice game this past week against the Bills, and he scored a touchdown. But, Jalen Noel, Xavier Hutchinson, all these guys have been incredibly inconsistent in terms of the volume they get. But Higgins has been the next most consistent behind Nico Collins. So I think he's kind of in that risky flex category. We talked about him in the waiver video. But, get the Colts this week in this secondary. I don't know. I feel like they've improved, but they're still in the bottom 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. So could be some wiggle room here for a guy like Higgins, as the Colts are going to likely have to focus on shutting down Nico Collins in this game. So we'll see how it shakes out. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think the Texans' passing attack, not particularly my favorite, so we'll see what happens. All right, then we move to the Colts. Michael Pittman in the start category for me, 13.7 fantasy points, showed up against the Chiefs this past week, 8 targets, 5 catches, 27 receiving yards. That was it, but he did find the end zone, so got you through, and I think he'll get you through again here in this, once again, big divisional matchup against the Texans. But bear in mind, the Texans have given up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, but he sees the most consistent volume, and I do believe that the Colts are going to need to throw the football in this game. But I do kind of worry. I mean, this is a big game. This Colts team, I've talked about in other videos, really tough end of season schedule here, and this is the first of 2 matchups against the Texans to wrap up the year, and they got to play the Jaguars twice as well. So this division is still basically wide open, as good as the Colts started off this season. And yeah, this Texans defense, the way they played against the Bills the other night, they look pretty sharp right now. But don't forget, Khalil Shakir had a really big receiving game as well on Thursday Night Football this past week for the Bills facing the Texans. So Pittman going to remain a start. Now, I talked this past week about Alec Pierce and Josh Downs both being, players that should be rostered, but being players that I thought were just flex options, and that was really it. And going into Week 13, I think they remain risky flex options. Pierce, 3.6 fantasy points against the Chiefs. Downs, 3 fantasy points. And, I think you could argue it was a game script where the Colts didn't really need to throw a ton, but then towards the end of the game they did, and we didn't really see crazy involvement from either wide receiver here. And I don't know, we could be in a similar situation here against the Texans, another really tough secondary. So they're just risky flex options for me, and I'm just going to leave it at that, moving into Week 13. Moving along, we have the Falcons traveling to face the Jets. We had no Drake London in Week 12, dealing with that knee issue, and now some early reports are indicating that the Falcons could be cautious moving forward with Drake London. And I don't even know what this Falcons team is. Like every single week, I feel like we get a different look from their offense and defense, and they've had a lot of injuries, and feel like they're getting close to wrapping it up, but that division is still open, especially with the Buccaneers having a lot of issues right now. So who knows? If Drake London plays this week, I think he's a start because it's Drake London. And Kirk Cousins was pretty effective throwing the football this past week, 199 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, an interception, a fumble, but maybe not as bad as some people were anticipating. So if London plays, he's a start. Obviously, if he doesn't play, can't roll with them. Darnell Mooney, not a ton of volume this past week, but he did have that long touchdown. Did have 16.4 fantasy points. So if you risked him last week, you feel pretty good. I think he's worth risking again if Drake London does not play here in Week 13. But the Jets, as bad as they've been, they've still been a top 12 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. So ultimately, if Mooney is out there as a primary number 1 wide receiver, worth a flex, and maybe worth a flex even if London is able to play. Then we move to the Jets side of things. I know some people don't want to touch this Jets offense, but I did talk about John Mechie in the waiver wire video. I know Tyrod Taylor's at quarterback, but No matter how you want to look at it or what you want to say, Mechie's had 13.5 fantasy points or more in 2 straight games and a touchdown in each of the last 2 games. And there's nobody else here to catch the football. I mean, Garrett Wilson's return looks like it's nowhere close. I mean, reports are indicating he's going to return this season, but it's like, is he really going to? What are the Jets really playing for? And then, like, outside of that, we got a little bit of Mason Taylor, slight volume to A.D. Mitchell, who still can't find a way to catch the football. So Mechie's the best receiving option here, and he's getting the volume. He's putting up the stat lines, and this Falcons defense very wishy-washy. At the end of the day, like I said, we never know what we're going to get out of them. So John Mechie is worth a flex, very lowly rostered, and maybe only a desperation flex, but he's still worth considering moving into Week 13. Next up, we have the Niners traveling to face the Browns. Let's start with the Niners side of things. And I am recording this before Monday Night Football like I have to do each and every week. So if there's any crazy injuries, which would have surprised me with the Niners, then there'll be a pinned comment down below. But for quite a few weeks now, I've just said, as long as they're healthy, Jawan Jennings, Ricky Pearsall are risky flex options. They get this Browns defense this week, which is certainly nothing to sneeze at. It's a top 10 unit against the wide receiver and the running back position. But I believe in this Niners offense. So as long as Jennings and Pearsall are healthy, they're worth the flex, but they do kind of fall into that risky flex category due to the nature of the Niners offense, but also due to the matchup here against the Browns. So we'll see how it shakes out. Then we move to those Browns wide receivers. Jerry Jeudy had 2.9 fantasy points this past week because he's Jerry Jeudy. 3 targets, 1 catch, 39 receiving yards, and a fumble. We do know that Shadur Sanders will get the start again at quarterback moving into Week 13 against the Niners. It wasn't as bad as some people anticipated, including maybe myself, but 209 passing yards, a passing touchdown, an interception, -1 rushing yards on the day, and really, I mean, a bulk of the total passing yardage went to that kind of screenplay to Dylan Sampson. So, you know, I don't know. We can't take that away from him, but it's not like the wide receivers were getting a ton of that volume. But we did see Cedric Tillman have 3 total targets in this game as well. Isaiah Bond had 2 targets. So once again, we're just kind of seeing the football like get spread around here. And we're also still seeing some volume to the tight end position. So, yeah, I don't really have any interest in any Browns wide receiver whatsoever. Moving into Week 13, they're all going to be sits for me. Next up, we have the Rams traveling to face the Panthers. Let's start with the Rams side of things. Puka Nacua, 11 targets, 7 catches, 97 receiving yards, 16.7 fantasy points. He continues to dominate. On a week-in, week-out basis, you're starting him no matter what. Devontae Adams, 8 targets, 5 catches, 62 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, 23.2 fantasy points. He also continues to dominate on a week-in, week-out basis no matter what. He now has a touchdown or more scored in every game since Week 7, with 3 games with 2 or more receiving touchdowns. I know Week 11 he got banged up and only had 1 catch, and it was a touchdown, so didn't really dominate, but he's getting the usage. He has the most red zone targets of any wide receiver in the league. And if I'm not mistaken, he also has the most receiving touchdowns of any wide receiver in the league. He is dominating right now. Panthers, sneaky good against wide receivers, 5th fewest fantasy points to the position, but you got to feel good if you have these guys. Matthew Stafford's playing lights out, MVP on the season so far. These guys are staying in your starting lineups. Now, I am recording this once again before Monday Night Football, so if there's any injury to T-Mac or any other Panthers wide receiver, I will let you guys know my thoughts down below. But I'm actually expecting T-Mac to have a pretty good game against a banged-up Niners secondary that's not playing great right now. So as long as he's healthy, I'm going to keep him in my lineups. I know this Rams defense, absolutely nothing to sneeze at, but they're kind of middle of the pack against wide receivers, although they have been playing better as of late. As that defense and pass rush continues to dominate, secondary is going to benefit from that. But yeah, T-Mac going to be a start for me, maybe a lower end start because I think Bryce Young's going to struggle a bit in this matchup, but I'm keeping T-Mac as a solid start as long as he's healthy. Xavier Legette, Jalen Coker, and they show up at times, more so Legette does, but I'm still just going to consider them sits because they are, for the most part, wildly inconsistent. Like I said, if my thoughts change due to Monday Night Football from Week 12, I'll let you guys know in the comments down below. Next up, we have a divisional matchup between the Jaguars and the Titans. Let's start with the Jaguars side of things. Jacoby Myers, 15 fantasy points in Week 12, 6 targets, 4 catches, 50 receiving yards, and a tutty. So this passing attack for the Jaguars looked pretty good this past week in a game scripted matchup that kind of forced them to throw the football. Trevor Lawrence had 256 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, also 3 interceptions and a lost fumble in very Trevor Lawrence-esque manner, right? And then also we saw very good involvement from Parker Washington. He kind of came back to earth in week 11, but this past week, 7 targets, 5 catches, 71 receiving yards, and a touchdown, 18.1 fantasy points. So I'm going to put them both in the start category, but kind of the elephant in the room is Brian Thomas, who has a pretty good chance here, according to early reports, to play here in week 13. How does that impact Myers and Washington? We'll find out. Also, Brenton Strange returned this past week. He saw pretty good volume at the tight end position, so that continues to impact these wide receivers. And last week, like I said, the game script forced him to throw. I don't quite know, even on the road here against the Titans, who their offense did look better this past week. I don't know if they're going to have to throw as much this week, so we'll see how it shakes out, and that's why Myers, Washington are kind of lower end starts, and we'll just kind of have to leave it at that as the week progresses. Maybe my thoughts will change. Then we move to the Titans. Like I said, they did improve this past week, at least throwing the football. Cam Ward had his first turnover-free game. No interceptions, no fumbles, 256 passing yards, a passing touchdown, but still wasn't great, and it was still the Titans' offense at the end of the day. But Chimere Dike showed up, 21.4 fantasy points, 7 targets, 5 catches, 44 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown, and a touchdown in the return game as well, as he has done throughout the course of the season. So Chimere Dike, worth a flex, but you just never exactly know what you're going to get in terms of this Titans offense on a week-in, week-out basis. Van Jefferson did nothing this past week, just 1 catch, 2.1 fantasy points. L.K. Manor is banged up. He missed this past week, so if you're going to start any Titans wide receiver, it's Chimere Dike, but do so with caution. But along, we will have the Cardinals traveling to face the Buccaneers. 2 teams dealing with different injuries throughout the course of the season. Let's go ahead and start with the Cardinals. Looks like there is a chance Marvin Harrison could play in week 13, but I feel like he's going to continue to miss time dealing with, recovering from appendix surgery, but we'll find out. If he plays, he's startable. It's Marvin Harrison Jr. The passing attacks look very good, which could be Brissett at quarterback. He's thrown for 258 or more passing yards in every start, 2 passing touchdowns in every game he started except for this past week. But this past week, he still had 49 passing attempts. So, yeah, there's going to be volume to go around here. I do worry about Michael Wilson and Greg Dortch, in their own respective manner if Marvin Harrison Jr. returns. But I think everybody here is still in consideration because this Buccaneers defense is slowly falling apart. They're getting worse and worse each week against the pass, bottom 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers, and they just got torched by, essentially Devontae Adams, but Puka Nacua and Devontae Adams throughout that game, and Matthew Stafford at quarterback. So good spot for all of the Cardinals wide receivers. I talked about Michael Wilson being a start this past week. I talked about Greg Dortch being a flex option. Michael Wilson dominated again, 15 targets, 10 catches, 118 receiving yards, 21.8 fantasy points, and Greg Dortch was a very solid flex option with 16.8 fantasy points, 9 targets, 6 catches, 53 receiving yards, and a touchdown. I think they all remain in those categories. Even if Marvin Harrison Jr. plays, I think at worst Michael Wilson is a flex and Greg Dortch is a risky flex, but obviously MH is going to get some type of volume here, and then Trey McBride is still seeing very substantial volume as he has had 9 or more targets in every game since week 6, and he's Trey McBride. So we'll kind of see how things shake out. I still kind of have a feeling that Marvin Harrison Jr. is not going to be good to go at this point in the season, and it's like, why would he really risk it? But we'll find out. We'll see what happens. Everybody here is at least still in consideration moving into the week. All right. The Buccaneers dealing with more and more injuries. Baker Mayfield has not been ruled out for week 13. We know he's dealing with a shoulder AC joint issue. If he doesn't play, Emeka Egbuka, Tez Johnson are risky flexes. If he does play, they're just kind of in that flex category. 8 targets, 3 catches, 32 receiving yards for Egbuka this past week, 6.2 fantasy points. These injuries are just really catching up with this Buccaneers team. Tez Johnson, also in the flex category, scored a touchdown this past week. It did come from Baker, not Teddy Bridgewater. He had 4 targets, 3 catches, 21 receiving yards, 12.3 fantasy points. So he still gets the involvement. We did see the return of Chris Godwin, but it was uneventful. 4 targets, 2 catches, 9 receiving yards, 2.9 fantasy points. And Sterling Shepard still hanging around too. He had 5 targets, 3 catches this past week. So Very low end flexes in Igbuka and Tez Johnson. Tez Johnson, more boomer bust. Igbuka, I'm pretty concerned about because, this Cardinals defense is nothing to sneeze at, and they showed up in big fashion this past week. They've been wishy-washy. They're still 15th against wide receivers. They're not awful against the wide receiver position. So, A, we got to find out, is Baker going to play or not? B, do you even feel good entirely if Baker plays? So, we'll see how things shake out, but right now, at this point in the week, I'm not feeling great about the Buccaneers wide receivers. All right, first game of the afternoon slate, we're going to have the Vikings traveling to face the Seahawks. And boy, oh boy, do we need to talk about this Vikings wide receiver room. I know the concerns have been high over the past couple weeks, but at this point, it's just too much. J.J. McCarthy, it feels like me or you could suit up at the quarterback position for the Vikings and have as much success as J.J. McCarthy. 87 passing yards this past week, 2 interceptions, an interception in every game since he returned to action in week 9 of the season. 2 interceptions in 3 straight games, and now he's in concussion protocol. Might not even play this week, which would mean Max Brosmer, the rookie, who is kind of like a Vikings fan favorite, but the rookie quarterback here would likely get the start unless they pull somebody from the practice squad or sign somebody, as Carson Wentz is not going to be an option currently on IR. So maybe that improves the passing attack for the Vikings. Maybe it doesn't. It's a tough matchup this week against the Seahawks defense. Top 12 against the wide receiver position on the year. So I'll leave JJ in the flex category because he's Justin Jefferson, but you can't really feel good about him at the end of the day either way. And if McCarthy gets a start, I don't even know if I would risk Justin Jefferson at that point. Not droppable, but you can't be feeling good if you own Justin Jefferson. Jordan Addison's a sit, 1 target, 0 catches this past week. Jalen Naylor's a sit. Don't get me wrong, it's a Kevin O'Connell offense. Any of these guys could end up showing up at any point, but you can't feel good if you own any Vikings wide receiver. And the only one that I would even consider with the stakes so high at this point in the fantasy season would be Justin Jefferson. On the other hand, if you own Jackson Smith and Jigba, you are feeling fantastic. The wide receiver 1 overall in fantasy, 37.1 fantasy points, a season high in week 12, 10 targets, 8 catches, 167 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. He is balling out. There's really nothing to talk about. It's a bit of a tough matchup against the Vikings, who have given up the fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, but I don't care. If you own JSN, no way you're sitting him. He's having a historic overall season. Rashid Shaheed, Cooper Kupp, Torrey Horton, whoever else is left here, just not going to be fantasy relevant. And if they do, it's very inconsistent. So we are not starting any of those guys. Really, the only wide receiver that I want to start in this matchup, who we don't even really need to break down, is Jackson Smith and Jigba. Moving along, we have the Bills traveling to face the Steelers. Let's start with the Bills side of things. Like we've viewed this wide receiver room for very many weeks now, Khalil Shakir is really the only wide receiver I would start. 17 fantasy points in week 12, 10 targets, 8 catches, 110 receiving yards. I encourage you guys to feel okay about Shakir, even though he had a really bad week 11 performance and what was actually a very high scoring game for the Bills. But nonetheless, I would feel very good once again here in week 13 as he faces the Steelers, who've allowed the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. One of 2 teams on the year to give up over 2,000 receiving yards. They've allowed 11 receiving touchdowns, and they have allowed the most receptions of any team in the league. So you got to feel good if you own Shakir. In terms of other wide receivers, there's really nobody else to talk about here. Like Terrell Shaver showed up in week 11, disappeared this past week, only on the field for 39% of snaps. Keon Coleman was a healthy inactive this past week. Who knows if he even plays this week? Josh Palmer still not fantasy relevant. We did see Gabe Davis show up, which kind of felt like deja vu, but he's still not going to be fantasy relevant. So Khalil Shakir is the wide receiver for the Bills to start, and it's that simple. Now, DK Metcalf is dealing with an ankle issue. He did end up with a rushing touchdown this past week, had 8 targets, 5 catches, 22 receiving yards, 14.4 fantasy points. We had him as a flex this past week. He's just going to continue to be a flex. Don't know if Rodgers or Rudolph's going to be the starting quarterback this week. I think it's probably going to be Rodgers, who almost played this past week. And ultimately gets the Bills, who are an okay defense, 14th overall against wide receivers. But, Metcalf, just a risky flex. especially with the ankle issue and the Steelers' offense being a bit stagnant in terms of their passing attack and questionable at the quarterback position. And now Metcalf also questionable. So flex option at best. We'll leave it at that. Moving in to week 13. All right, final game of the afternoon window on Sunday is going to be the Raiders traveling to face the Chargers. Let's start with the Raiders. Trey Tucker, 10 targets, 3 catches, 28 receiving yards, 5.8 fantasy points. Tyler Lockett, 5 targets, 4 catches, 62 receiving yards, 10.2 fantasy points. Donta Thornton, Jack Bech, not really worth even breaking down, but they are also wide receivers on this roster. Don't know if Geno Smith is finally going to get benched this week or not, or if like an injury is going to show up for Geno Smith. Maybe we see some Aiden O'Connell. Maybe we see some Kenny Pickett. Does it really matter? It doesn't for me. These guys are all sits on the road against the Chargers, who I have a feeling this defense is going to be very opportunistic coming out of their bye week. So not interested in any Raiders wide receiver this week. Then we move to the Chargers. Ladd McConkey is going to remain in the start category for me. I know week 11 wasn't pretty, but once again, Chargers, extra time to rest, prepare for this matchup against the Raiders, who have an awful secondary, giving up the 27th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, bottom 10 unit. They've been awful. I know they weren't like bad this past week, but that's because they played Shedeur Sanders and the Browns and Jerry Jeudy. Like they got torched the week before by George Pickens and CeeDee Lamb, and I expect the Chargers to come out of the gate here swinging to get Ladd McConkey involved. Good matchup for him. He should be a start. And now I don't feel entirely confident in Keenan Allen or Quentin Johnston, as we haven't seen a double-digit fantasy performance for either wide receiver since week 9, and since week 8 of the season, only one double-digit fantasy performance for either guy here. But either of them could score. It's a good enough matchup against the Raiders that, I think they're in the flex category. Once again, it's a divisional matchup, and this is the easiest matchup that the Chargers are going to have for the next couple of weeks. They're going to wrap up the season after this matchup with the Eagles, the Chiefs, the Cowboys, the Texans, and in week 18, which we don't really care about, but against the Broncos. So it's a really tough end-of-season stretch. So I think they're going to try and make the most of this one, and this is probably, maybe outside of Dallas, the best overall matchup that we'll get for the Chargers wide receivers on it the rest of the season. All right, Sunday Night Football, we will have both the Broncos and the Commanders coming out of their bye week, but the Broncos obviously traveling to face the Commanders. Talking about bad defenses, well, this Commanders secondary has given up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, so this is a great spot for both Courtland Sutton and Troy Franklin. I know it's been tough to trust Courtland Sutton on a weekly basis, but he had just as many targets as Troy Franklin the last time we saw this team in action in week 11 against the Chiefs. So it's a great matchup. Extra time to rest, extra time to prepare. Big game for the Broncos, who are have higher playoff stakes definitely than the Commanders do right now. One of the top teams in the AFC in terms of their overall rankings. So this is a game where I think Sutton and Franklin will be involved. I think we can trust both of them against a really, really bad Commanders secondary. So they will both be starts for me, and I would start them both with confidence. Then we look to the Commanders. Couple question marks here. Don't know if Terry McLaurin's ever going to play again, but he has been practicing this week. So we could see Terry McLaurin, coming out of the bye week in action against the Commanders. So I'll put him in the risky flex category at best. We also, Marcus Mariota is banged up. The reports are that he's probably going to play, but we could see a quarterback change. And no, not to Jaden Daniels, but I don't even know what that would mean. Josh Johnson is the emergency quarterback for the Commanders. So I think probably Mariota will play, but it's just a bad matchup overall for everybody involved against this Broncos defense, giving up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers on the season. So Debo, a risky flex, the player that has had the most fantasy value on the season at the wide receiver position. He has scored a touchdown in each of the last 2 games and had double digits. And I do think if Terry McLaurin plays, that actually helps out Debo Samuel in terms of that defensive pressure. But I'll leave Debo as a risky flex. It's a tough matchup, even at home, even coming out of the bye week on Sunday Night Football against the Broncos here in Week 13. All right, last but not least, we have Monday Night Football. The Giants will travel to face the Patriots. So let's start with the Giants side of things. This is kind of a tough one to call at this point in the week because we don't know if Jackson Dart or Jameis Winston is going to be the starting quarterback at the time I record this. I guess arguably I feel better if it's Jameis Winston. I do think that Jackson Dart has a strong likelihood to sit here in week 13 through the bye week. I mean, why would the Giants risk Jackson Dart at this point in his career? They've already been eliminated from the playoffs or firing coaches left and right. And, just give us another Jameis Winston start. It's a holiday week. It's fun. It's exciting. And at least it'll be something to look forward to. And at least, it gives us some fantasy value for these wide receivers. Not that Jackson Dart didn't, but maybe a higher ceiling with Robinson having 30.6 fantasy points this past week. Receiving touchdown, 14 targets, 9 receptions and 156 receiving yards. Now, this Patriots defense, still nothing to sneeze at. They didn't quite show up against the Bengals this past week, and they're not great against the pass. We know they're much better against the run, but I think Rondell Robinson, a solid flex. I think some people might not like that. Like they might think he should be viewed a little bit higher, but just don't forget, he's been very inconsistent over the past couple of weeks. He had 7.6 fantasy points in week 11. So I think he's a solid flex, really regardless of the quarterback position, but a higher upside flex if Winston's the starter this week, and more of a floor type flex if Jackson Dart's the starting quarterback. Now, Darius Slayton returned to action this past week, 2 targets, 1 catch. He didn't see any upside, 3.3 fantasy points. Did see some volume to Isaiah Hodgins. Once again, he's had 10.7 or more fantasy points in 2 straight games. Did score a touchdown this past week, had 12.2 fantasy points. So I know we talked about him in the waiver video. He's kind of like a desperation option. And really, he's only had that chemistry with Winston, although he's only played for the Giants over the past 2 weeks this season. So a lot of like moving pieces here. We'll kind of see how it shakes out. Hodgins may be a desperation option. Then we move to the Patriots side of things. Stephon Diggs remains a low-end start. Only 4 fantasy points this past week. I kind of talked about this. We talked about it earlier in the video, right? I talked about it going into this past week. Like the Bengals are sneaky good against wide receivers. 3 targets, 2 catches, 20 receiving yards. That was it. Like I said, just 4 fantasy points in. That was in a game script where the Patriots needed to throw the football, but Drake May had some struggles this past week. I think it'll blow over here against the Giants. This is a great spot. This Giants defense still bottom 10 against a wide receiver position. They just got torched by Amon-Ra St. Brown. So this is a good spot for Stephon Diggs. He remains a low-end start for me. Then Kayshon Boutte, just kind of like a risky flex. Probably should literally be in the risky flex category. 2 targets, 2 catches this past week, 15 receiving yards, 3.5 fantasy points. That was it. But he was on the field for 80% of snaps. It was his first game in return from injuries. So I think he could be in the flex category. Riskier option though, based on the matchup against the Giants. And then, that kind of brought like Mac Hollins back to earth, who was showing up a bit in the previous weeks. He just had 5 fantasy points, but he was on the field for 86% of snaps, so still worth paying attention to. And then like Demario Douglas only on the field for 17% of snaps. Kyle Williams only on the field for 7% of snaps. So I'm going to go ahead and set any other Patriots wide receiver as we move into week 13. And there you guys have it. Every single matchup, every single wide receiver, who you should be starting and who you should be sitting here in week 13 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comments down below. So please drop me your guys' fantasy questions. I'll get back to as many of you guys as I can throughout the week. And while you guys are down there, does me a huge favor, helps out the channel tremendously when you guys hit that subscribe button and that like button on the way out. And when the videos and playlists pop up on the screen as the week progresses, we're going to have everything that you guys could possibly need to dominate this week and every coming week of the fantasy season. So with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.